I've been informed that this is mostly Matt's point of view, which makes sense because we have Diamond Weapon in the title, and I do not believe Michael is that far. But let's listen to Bellular Clips talk about Final Fantasy XIV's strengths.
As for you, you did want to talk about Diamond Weapon stuff.
I did want to talk.
In our
Yeah,
last stream.
yeah,
Got to that.
that's right.
Should I bring up the notes?
Nah, it's fine. Don't think I wrote any notes. I just scribbled down stuff I wanted to think about. But no, I finished the.
I don't think I wrote any notes. I think I just wrote notes.
This was like, what, a week? What? How does time work?
Oh, barely.
How does time work? Because I don't know if that was a week ago or 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now.
A year.
But anyway, no, Diamond Weapon Extreme. Fucking sick. It's, man, I immediately like what I've seen of Extreme stuff more than like normal raids and WoW by significant.
Now, as extremes go, for people that are looking to get into Savage or Extreme for the first time, the 0.5 patch is the easiest time to go get Extreme clears because all but the most recent one are really easy from a gearing perspective, and then the most recent one is very well documented at that point in the patch, right? Because we've had this for a very long time at this point, and there's really nothing else for anybody else to be doing. So if they want to go run Extreme with you, they don't have, maybe they want the mount or something like that. So there's a number of people that will help you through it. And then Diamond Extreme in particular is a fight that, like, I watched the guides multiple times, and then I went in with a group where I think like 5 or 6 people had done it before. And we got the clear on the second pull. And I'm not saying you're going to have that kind of luck. It's definitely a fight that's got some ways it can go really sideways, but it's very forgiving. It's a fight where, like, you failing a phase is not a failure of a fight on its own. A wipe is going to be most often because either multiple people are making mistakes simultaneously or you're missing multiple phases. And so it is very forgiving as an extreme fight. So if you go run Diamond Weapon, you're like, I love this, and I've always been interested in extreme. I think the weapon series in general, tied to the Stars of Roulette questline, was really, really good this expansion. So go clear that questline as new players. And if you want to try a hard fight, this is an ideal time to easily get yourself into 510s, some 520s, maybe even some 530s, and then go blast down some Diamond EX at least once.
Good margin a lot of the time, just because it felt so. It's the idea of you have to react. Everything's so simple that you get. It's like I don't even know how to describe it properly, but like execution is hard enough that you never get to just kind of zone out.
Yeah.
The pacing of things coming in is always next thing, next thing, next thing, next thing, but not like overwhelming. It's always like, oh, I've handled that. Okay, where am I at? And it's like the way I explained it, I think to you a couple times, how this stuff worked was, or how it feels to me, is like there's parallel processing going on where you're going through what you're doing in your job, and then you hop over to the thread of dealing with a fight. And because of how it's paced, it feels really not gentle, but it feels like you've got loads of time to parallel process everything that goes through.
Yeah.
And you've got all of the time to think of everything. So having, like, hopping into a group and going,
Yeah, I think as a fight, he's hitting on the fact that, like, sometimes it feels like something. So as a fight, there are these two platforms, and there are times where, like, people on platform A need to jump over to platform B, and if you're on platform B, there's not really that much you need to do. And so there definitely are kind of downtimes to kind of catch your breath. But also just extreme in general is a very, very gentle increase to what normal is. And so if you're doing normal and you're just getting the clear and you're like, oh, I took hits, you're probably not ready for extreme. But if you're doing normal and you're not getting hit by anything and you're getting clean clears every single time, then at that point, the jump to extreme is very, very gentle because it's basically, mechanics 1, 2, and 3, and occasionally in normal, you're seeing maybe mechanics 1 and 2 back to back and 2 and 3 back to back. And so it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3. And like, that's how normal is. We teach you a mechanic and then we start combining those mechanics in rapid succession. So you're already in that mindset and you're adjusting very well. Well, extreme is just the same thing, but a little bit quicker, and then occasionally an additional mechanic added on top that's new. But once again, that mechanic is very much taught. It's, here's what we're doing. Okay, now here's what we're doing for real. And so I think in general, Diamond EX is a very, very gentle increase above Diamond normal. So I do think that I understand what he's saying. The rotations in this game are very, very different per class. There are classes that are absolutely just a rotation, just literally 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 6, and you're just doing these abilities over and over and over, and they don't really adjust too much situationally. You might have some off global cooldown things for tanks where it's like, oh, I have tanking mitigation and stuff I can weave in, but ultimately you're building towards a big portion of your rotation, and then you're burning that, and then you're building and you're burning that. There are other jobs that are more reactive, right? Jobs where something like Red Mage, where there's a little bit of like paying attention to a little bit of context, or jobs like Dancer, where it's more proc based. And so you are then at that point you have more of a skill priority, and then you're looking at what's available to you of your skills and you're choosing accordingly. But once again, as you settle into that, you know, okay, well, I'm always going to do skill 1 if it's available. If not, I'm going to do skill 2, and then I'm working my way down the list. And so you're just pushing through the rotation, and every time it forks, you're taking the premier path. And really the only time jobs change drastically from that in this game are the shift from single target to AoE, which is not something that we do a lot of in large group content. The AoE rotations typically are going to be seen more in something like zone-based content, Bozjas, Zadnor, Fates, or in dungeons where we're heavy pulling. We don't really have that much trash in any of our 8 and 24 man content that results in just large, constant overstreaming AoE. And so I think that the AoE rotation is something that in this game kind of gets overlooked, in my opinion. I think that it's also something that doesn't get taught, because when you're doing AoE rotations, you don't do that when you're going through the story single player, because you're not really pulling big, especially as classes like Black Mage, where you have a really strong AoE, but you're wearing cloth, and so you're not going to pull 15 things while leveling. And so I do think this game shies away from AoE, and so I think that settles you into most of the time you're doing your single target rotation. So when you get into fights that are very predictable, the whole thing feels like, okay, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, and I know what the fight's supposed to be doing. Can I marry those together, and can I do it really well?
Someone spams a macro that gives everyone's position, and people call out what marker they're going to take. Someone throws the world markers up, and everyone just goes. But all 8 people are actually going ham. All 8 people are falling, like, 4 people are moving at a time to do a mechanic. Sometimes it's 2 people moving. Sometimes it's like, all 8 have to dance to avoid the flood ray, which I think I've started calling floor ray because it kills so many people. But like, dealing with flood ray is just such an enjoyable thing to do. It's not like the most difficult thing to do. It's not like it's the most complex thing to strategize around. It is literally just, you've got your number, you stand where you're supposed to be. You see, oh, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4. Oh, I guess you'd be 7. Is it 7? Yeah, you'd be 7. So 3 gets hit. So 3 moves, 7 moves into their place. And it's just so satisfying to do this, especially with a group of 7 people who are competent and, have maybe have done it before, maybe haven't done it before. And it's just so interesting to me, where I really enjoyed it in a way. I was like, fuck, that was really fun. And then I tried it a couple different times, different party, didn't get it, killed again. But I was like, man, this is actually really fun. And now I'm immediately going, okay, well, I want to do that, but I want to do it on a job that's harder than Bard. Not to say I did very well. I definitely dropped my dots, but I'd love to try this.
I do think there are some jobs that feel a little easier to me, but I also think there's something to be said for just playing on a different role. So rather than saying like, okay, harder, I would say just as an additional challenge, in addition to what Matt's saying, we're like, absolutely challenge yourself. But I would raise it one step further than Matt and say, if he's switching off a Bard and he's looking for real change, do you have the ability to heal that fight? Do you have the ability to tank that fight? So I would say that as somebody who is starting to level up any of the remaining jobs that I've never leveled, I'm really enjoying the perspective it offers, and I think it really helps me understand why you should tank it in a certain area, and what the importance of mitigation is, and what healing is. And as a DPS, like when they say spread, don't just spread as far as you possibly can, like spread as far as you need to, but stay within AoE range of healers. And so I think that you become a better player as you learn to read a fight from multiple perspectives, because then the fight drops away as a variable. Now that you've played all of the roles across one fight, you now can look at that fight from all these perspectives, and that makes all future fights something where you can at least picture what those perspectives might be thinking. So I would actually take it one step further. I think that playing on more than one job is very admirable, and so like what Matt is saying here is a great start. But when you're saying, well, what other job should I play it on? If you're really uncomfortable, maybe just play it on another job in the same role. That way you're doing all the same things, but with a different rotation. But if you're really looking for a challenge, I wouldn't say, okay, what's the hardest job I can do it on? I would say, what is the job most different than what the job I'm doing it now on is, which is most likely going to be something of a different role, where you're jumping from DPS to healing, and it's just a drastically different encounter.
The same thing again, but playing ninja, or maybe tank it next time, something like that. And I'm very close because my ninja's 75. So I'd love to do, but it was just like the mechanics were all just really well done. That's how I felt.
It'll be a long time before I get to see any of this shit.
Well, that's the thing. You can do extremes at 50, like Asmon's been doing, just not, just not modern content.
Yeah, so that's him doing the extremes at 50, and because he's doing it at 50, it's like unsynced. It's just sort of going in like.
Well, he's doing minimum item level, no echo.
So yeah.
So he's doing it as close as possible to originally intended. And extremes are kind of in the realms of normal difficulty, where they're not that hard. They're not that hard,
so,
but they're hard enough.
When he does that, is he doing that like all with people in the same state as him?
Yeah, because
so there's no like stronger players who are sinking down.
I mean there are, but they're sinking to the minimum item level.
Okay.
So and because stats and stuff are so simple generally, then it is fairly close.
It seems like, at least based on, because I was looking at parses, not that you're supposed to be doing any of that, but I was looking at, or not parses, it was sims. I was looking at sims of the various different jobs, and it was surprising how close they all were. And when I think about them having generally a more simple itemization system, more simple design, less, there's not player freedom in how your thing plays. It does seem like it's a way more just syncable game. Or it seems like if you try to do the same thing in WoW, like just the shit would start breaking.
So you have two choices in the game. You have the choice of bring the player, not the class, or bring the class, not the player. And what that really results in is, does the class have a unique identity? And as it has a unique identity, you have classes that have individual spells that become something that is worth having, and that class is the only way to get at it. And so the way you allow the player to become more important than the class is you make the class become less important. And the way you do that is you create redundancies in what makes that class bring utility to the raid. And so when you have multiple classes capable of like resurrecting in combat, then you don't need a class to be there as a dedicated reser. And so like Summoner and Red Mage being the two non-healers that can res, Red Mage is the most common because of their instant res. But imagine if Necromancer gets, if Reaper gets an instant res. That's going to take away from what Red Mage brings to progression raids. And so when you start to homogenize, there are complaints around that. There are complaints within 14 that all of the tanks feel very, very similar, and that we're going to have the healers split into basically two types of healer, and they will probably feel very, very similar. That, there are complaints within 14 that class identity is something that's been stripped away. But the advantage of that is that we've created really narrow gaps between a lot of these classes in what they bring to a party. And so it means that the devs have intentionally come out and said they do not want there to be a class in the game that people want, that first of all people don't want to play, and that people who play it don't feel can clear any of the content. So any of the content should be clearable with any of the classes. And we have regularly seen in Race for World Firsts where the meta has been shattered, where people have said, of the tanks, this tank is garbage, and then the World First has that tank present. And so the gaps just aren't that big. I will say our gearing system is incredibly flat. And the pros of that is that you're not chasing a bunch of weird optimization. The cons of that is that there's very little customization to get into for people that like that stat optimization. The only real stat optimization that exists is within materia, but the problem is because your gear is shared across a role, your materia slots become something where you have to start prioritizing when, like, Warrior, for example, wants different melds than the other 3 tanks. And so I wish they would move melds off the gear and maybe onto the job stones so that you could have something where the materia was more job specific. Materia at this point has become such an easy currency to get and such an easy currency to maintain because everybody can retrieve it at a worst case scenario of 40%. And so materia outside of overmelding, when you start to talk about crafting like pentameld systems and stuff, there really isn't that much uniqueness within your choices within a gearing standpoint. So the pros of that is that when you just want to raid, when you just want the content, it is very easy. Don't worry about what class you're playing. Play whichever one you think is cool, whichever one you think is fun. Doesn't matter. Of course, it's going to find a group. And when it comes to gearing, just equip the highest item level and you're probably fine. When there are multiple of the highest item level, there's one that's slightly better, but stat optimization is not a bunch of reforging and enchants and all this stuff. It's just do what, you know, the website tells you to do. It really is that straightforward. There's just abyss. You're not like, oh, well, I need to keep my my belt from across not my belt because we're getting rid of those, but I need to keep my chest piece from across multiple tiers because I might want to swap one out because I'm going to lose this stat when I upgrade this piece in item level, and I'm going to want that stat to come back, and so it's worth dropping a few item levels to bring this. There is none of that. There is a BIS, and then there is a second best, and then that really is it. And so the advantage of that is that to new players coming in or players who don't want to spend a bunch of time doing things that are not just in the content, killing the bosses, all of that has been stripped away.
Yeah.
All over the show, right? So
Yeah, well, I will have the disclaimer that it's not perfect in FF because design changes over the years, especially when you're going back to A Realm Reborn stuff, design changes over the years make it significantly easier. Because, as an example, TP used to exist. Now it doesn't. So you've not got that problem of, like, as an example, a warrior can now hold AoE aggro all day long. Whereas previously, you do a couple overpowers, you're out of TP, you're like, fuck.
And like what I'm describing here is something that Matt is hitting on, is something that has been a series of decisions, not only where Final Fantasy started with the relaunch in A Realm Reborn, but where it's headed. Because from here, we used to have 3 bars. We used to have health, mana, and your TP, your tactical points or whatever it stood for. And that was used for things like sprint. And there were classes that used that for their abilities. And so physical classes use that. As a caster, it never really bothered me. So like I just used it. And so you had to decide, like, how do I do this? We also used to have mana as something that you could control instead of everybody having a static amount of mana. And so over the years, we have simplified the combat system repeatedly. Tanks now have a tank stance that just gives them a flat, like 10x immunity or something like that, which just pushes them right to the top of the threat table. And so over the years, we have dropped the skill floor, the minimum amount of skill and energy and knowledge required to get into the game. As a result, we have seen the skill ceiling in some areas come down, and so the top end players who enjoy pushing that theoretical maximum are bummed when the ceiling has to get dropped because the whole thing drops when they make a change. So I would love to see them find ways to add the ceiling back in while maintaining that low skill floor that invites players who just want to come in and get through all the content on normal. That's totally fine. So I do think that over the years, like, what we're describing is the result of iterative change. It's where we've gotten to. It's not where we started.
Fuck this. Or, you know, as an example, physical jobs can now sprint. Because it used to be if they sprint...
physical jobs couldn't sprint in the past.
They could sprint, but sprint would take up all your TP. And that's what physical attacks relied on.
TP being
I think it was called tactical points.
Okay, like I literally just did.
Yeah, so there's HP, MP, and there was TP.
Right.
And that was used to, like, stop you from spamming your strongest physical abilities.
Yeah.
It regenerated at roughly around the rate of your standard rotation would drain it. But then if you sprinted, it emptied it all. Which means, you know.
The problem with TP that made it really hard to balance is that casters didn't ever need it. And so you could just burn it whenever. And what made it difficult is when you tried to balance like movement mechanics, because casters had so much movement and melee took such a penalty for needing to get out of something and popping sprint. So unless you're going to make the classes move inherently differently, it was really unfair that you had this basically free sprint for half the group, and then you had this high cost sprint for everybody else.
You sprint as a melee thing.
And something you can't.
Yeah, don't have TP respiration. Now you're out of stuff to attack. And that's like one small part, because there's obviously loads of class job changes. There's loads of like role actions that are different and new now.
So the way role actions used to work is it used to be that you had to level up like all these different jobs to get access to jobs from them in a very like Guild Wars 1 type way, where like certain abilities were what was called cross-class abilities, where they could be borrowed, but only after you had them unlocked. So you had to go do those classes to get that skill unlocked so that you could have it. And so that's what allowed you to have, I think like Provoke for tanks was one of those abilities where you had to go level Paladin up to like 15 or 20 or something like that to get Provoke for all of your other tanks. And so there were certain abilities that you needed to have an optimal rotation. So your class was kind of sub-optimized. This was incredibly prevalent within crafting. And so crafting, there was very much an omni-crafter was the desired goal. And what order you leveled them up in might have even been something that people were recommending new players optimize, because what order you unlock those cross-class skills determines the difficulty it takes to become an omni-crafter in the first place. From there, that got a lot of pushback, and so what they moved to was just role actions in general. So they just made a series of those, and they basically just stripped away the need to level the alternate classes. You don't need to know what those other classes look like. You don't need to know where their class trainer is. You don't need to have their job stone ever. Don't even worry about it. You're good. We'll just give you access to their abilities, and then you'll get to choose from those. Meanwhile, we're adding skills to the bar, and we're pruning skills to keep skill bloat at bay. And so that's something that is going to continue going into Endwalker, where we add more abilities, which means old abilities will either be combined or stripped. So rip, protect. We moved to role actions, and then they made you choose. And so this is where you have that kind of player optimization. So you have, let's say 10 abilities. But what people find very quickly is that, well, you get to bring so many, but very quickly you feel like you don't really have a choice, and the best one is the best one. The second best one's the second best one. The third best one's the third best one. And so you very quickly feel like, okay, no matter how many you give me, the beginning of that for most, if not all, classes in the game are going to be taking majority the same things, and then there might be a little bit of flex in those last remaining spots. And people were creating like macros to swap them out and weird stuff, and they were saying, well, you should just increase the number. And in my mind, that takes away choice. Like, there is no choice if the answer is, do you want to take door 1 or 2? And you're like, well, I want to take both. Well, then you're not choosing. And so players complained long enough, and they said, you know what, we were looking at making changes to the system anyway, and so they just said, for now, screw it, you can just bring all of them. And keyboard players everywhere rejoiced, and controller players everywhere said, like, why would you do that? And so then we had like 1,000 buttons on the bar all at once, because it was never designed to be like that. Now we've moved in further into the role-based actions. So now we've really started to say, okay, what is a role? Because at this point, we're now starting to move to role quests. We used to have class skills unlocked as you leveled up doing your class quest, which is the tiny little subtext that appears below your main scenario quest. And you do that to unlock all your class quests. Well, starting after level 70, those go away because it got expensive to write quests for every single class all the time. And so now we move to role quests. So in general, the game is moving to be much more role heavy and much less class heavy. Classes are just flavors of a role, and we really have homogenized down to where the role will share that quest, the role will share that gear, the role will share those base actions where you can go say, you know what, every tank needs an interrupt. What if we just make the interrupt a role action? That every tank is going to need some additional mitigation. So let's make some base mitigation a role action. Whatever you want to do. If you want to put provoke as it, and that gives you the ability to say, you know what, there's certain abilities that do not fit within the flavor of a class, and everybody in that role needs it. So now we won't have to justify it as, oh, well, that doesn't feel like that class. That's fine. It's not from that class. It's from that role. And so it gives them the ability to say the flavor is the flavor, and the base core mechanics of a class can almost be baked in as a role-based thing. So it's given them a little more flex to just further balance the way different classes within a role perform.
Because role actions weren't in ARR; they were in the cross-class days, where you would, similar idea, but you would borrow moves from other classes, and then there's kind of a, how to put it, there's kind of a meta there that you had to do so everyone had the same sort of roughly, but it's very different, but it's as close as reasonable. It's as close as reasonable, and it just makes for, you know, slightly easier, but still, you know, you can't just skip mechanics.
Yeah.
Basically, you have to do the fight roughly close to design. Maybe not as hard, but yeah, you still have to do it. And I really interested in, once we have a good couple players from the guild up at like decent levels, I wouldn't mind going back and setting aside time to do some of the extremes in the way they were, or even doing what do you call it? Even doing coil. Doing coil synced seems like it would be very bad.
I definitely want to do all this shit properly.
Yep.
That's why I've not been rushing through the game.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't see the point in rushing through a game. It's that thing, like it's really easy to progress through a game if you're a streamer, because turns out sitting down and playing the game is your job. For us, it ain't like that.
Honestly,
you know?
That's gonna vary by creator. What did Mountain Dew say? Asmongold spent 30% of his life reacting to himself. So like it depends on the content that the streamer puts out, right? And so like saying you're a streamer is really loose, because they're literally streaming video game based content right now. I'm literally streaming video game based content right now, and in neither case was any of us at the time of these recordings playing the game. And when you are playing the game, sometimes you can progress, but sometimes, I mean, it depends on the person. Somebody like Lama Todd has built an entire career out of playing the same content over and over and teaching it to people, and that's very, very different. And so, you know, I think it also depends on, does that person's goal, like, are they progressing in the way they want to progress? You know, there are some people that get tied to making certain types of content, so they have to clear that. And that got that way because they wanted to. You know, Ethos Asher has talked about making lore content for Final Fantasy XIV, and it got that way because he wanted to. But now, when new content comes out, he has this burden of, you know, do I get to do the game the way I want to play, or do I now have to play it in a format that was established by previous me, whether or not I want to? If I want to make lore content, that happens to be okay, but it doesn't always feel good. Like if somebody comes in and says, hey, we're leaving and we're going here right now, and you're like, well, do I get a choice? No. Well, like if that's where you wanted to go, it's not that much friction, but it doesn't feel good just the same. And so I don't know that it's that straightforward. I think sometimes Michael puts kind of like all streamers in like this one bucket as like, you know, here at Bellular, we do our content, and then the rest of the world does content in this one way. Because he made a previous comment that was like, you know, you should never, ever, ever be streaming your first playthrough of main story. That there's just, and it almost implied that there's like no place for that you're doing it wrong. And so I think for anybody out there that's thinking of a content creator that they enjoy, or thinking of becoming a content creator, or is in that journey, just do you. Like, just do you. They're just doing them. They do a beautiful and wonderful job of it. And, you know, statements like this, when they're stated among things that are so heavily based in, like, either very educated opinions or based in literal fact when covered by Bellular Gaming, these comments in particular are just very, very opinion-based. And so just be careful to say that, like, you know, all content creators are any one thing, even if that statement is as simple as all content creators get to progress really fast. Because you might have a content creator who's like, I really love this game right now, but it's not a game I can play on stream. I know Rich Campbell's talked about that. Like, I'm really enjoying this game, but it's not making for good streaming content. So when do I get to play it? In which case, in his mind, yes, he's making progress in some game, but from his mental state, there's a game he actively wants to play, and he's not getting to play it because of his career, even though his career is playing video games.
I have genuinely been feeling some wild amount of envy for all these streamers playing FF.
Same, yeah.
And they're just like, oh my god, look at them. They're doing like, they've got the energy to do more difficult content. We've got all that stuff. Whereas like, I'm home from a day of work, I'm like, I'm doing leveling roulette and then going to bed. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah. That's the funny thing about it. That's just what it is when you're doing VOD content that's not based on live gameplay.
Yeah.
So that's our fault. That said, we're getting better and better at doing VOD content.
Sorry.
How'd you get in the WoW numbers video?
Oh, not quite finished, but getting there.
Okay. I'm almost done with Terrellian, and Khadgar's done as well, so...
Yeah. By the numbers is almost
gaming
finished.
time may be coming soon. Maybe he's finally got ahead of his scripts and work, and he can play video games again.
Hope so.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Go for it.
Well, I would love to hear where his progress is. Every once in a while, he has a side comment on, an opinion he has about Final Fantasy XIV, and based on that opinion, sometimes we can get some context on how far he is. He recently, in a video, made a comment about getting to use the Disciple of War gear that he has in his armory chest, and that gives us some indication to the fact that his armory chest still has room for Disciple of War gear, which we know drops off at a certain point. And so, like, there are points that tell me kind of how far he is, but he never has kind of checked in. He's talked about wanting to make those kind of progression videos, so I hope that he either is making those or is planning on making those, and maybe the reason he hasn't made them is that A, he hasn't published them, so they are made, or that B, he just hasn't progressed far enough to make one of those videos, in which case we haven't missed one. Not that I don't want him to progress, I do want him to progress, but I would love to hear about that journey. I think that the thoroughness and the level of like just gaming wide education that they bring to the space, I really look forward to kind of their opinion, because I think that while they may have opinions that other new players are also having, they'll do a very good job of vocalizing that opinion. And sometimes a portion of the community might be thinking a certain way about being a new player right now, which is not something I can try because I already have all this experience in my head. And if they don't know how to tell me, then I don't know what those new players are thinking. So I look forward to kind of seeing him represent at least some portion of what a new player might experience as he gets into Final Fantasy XIV, guided, or whatever him having Matt there means, kinda.